On April 29, 2013, a National Air Cargo 747 cargo airliner took off from the Bagram Air Force Base military facility in Afghanistan. As the nose passed through its climb angle, it continued to rise until its longitudinal axis became almost perpendicular with the ground. The plane hung on its four engines, which were each producing takeoff power. With no forward momentum to build lift, the plane began to fall, tail first. The nose came down too late, and as the B-747 completely surrendered to gravity, it leveled off before striking the earth with the nose 30 degrees down. Impact with the ground was violent, catastrophic, and final. The National Air Cargo Flight 102 accident was a unique tragedy. It represented an opportunity to throw a broad light on operations that go unseen because they operate where the FAA cannot go. When the report is read, the accident of N949CA, the National Air Cargo 102 accident aircraft, the actual cause of the accident wasn't what the NTSB said it was. Not even close. Hello, I'm Stephen Carbone, and this is By Reason of Air Safety. I've taught this accident countless times in many FAA classes, and what I bring out to my students is how to determine root cause, as we will do now. As a former NTSB major accident investigator, I find National Transportation Safety Board accident reports to be disappointing on so many levels. As a former Federal Aviation Administration aviation safety inspector, I find NTSB accident reports as a group to be devoid of any regulatory facts. As a former airline mechanic and operations manager, I find NTSB accident reports to be bereft of any understanding of what actually happens in the airline industry, no matter what air operator is being investigated. NTSB accident reports are becoming works of fiction, composed of speculation and hearsay. They're supposed to resolve severe safety failures and prevent future mishaps. Accident reports must not misinterpret the data or drive attention in the wrong direction. Getting it wrong doubles the danger by fixing things that aren't broken while distracting away from what needs to be corrected. As I promised, By Reason of Air Safety, we'll take the singular lead in demonstrating ongoing NTSB accident investigation failures by introducing my sub-series, Rooting Out What is Probable. The purpose of this series is to take the viewer on a tour of accident reports and explore how these reports are only false narratives for public consumption. Rooting Out What is Probable is not a scheduled podcast. These accident analyses are to be scattered through the By Reason of Air Safety podcasts, giving opportunity for other podcast topics and interviews. To be clear, the Rooting Out What is Probable episodes will not disappoint. The NTSB effect is serious. It builds complacency, the most dangerous safety challenge. But first, we need to understand what accident investigations must provide, namely truthful, factual information, root cause analysis that prevent or mitigate future accidents as referenced in the Title 49 CFRs. Today, we're going to review our first accident with the strict adherence to root cause analysis. National Air Cargo Flight 102 was an accident that took place while taking off out of Bagram Air Force Base in Afghanistan. In the National Air Cargo Flight 102 NTSB Accident Report, AAR 1501, the findings, probable cause, and recommendations each show the NTSB's fundamental lack of understanding about how airlines work, specifically cargo airlines flying supplemental operations, how cargo is correctly weighed and the weights recorded, how cargo is actually loaded and locked in position, and how in-flight forces on cargo are compensated for. To start, let's first examine the accident report's probable cause. The NTSB determined the probable cause of this accident was National Airlines' inadequate procedures for restraining special cargo loads, which resulted in the loadmaster's improper restraint of the cargo, which moved aft and damaged the hydraulic systems numbers 1 and 2 and horizontal stabilizer drive mechanism components, rendering the airplane uncontrollable. Contributing to the accident was the Federal Aviation Administration's inadequate oversight of national airlines' handling of special cargo loads. To begin with, let's break down the probable cause into two sections. For one, the NTSB determined the probable cause was National's inadequate procedures for restraining special cargo and special cargo loads, which resulted in the loadmaster's improper restraint of the cargo. So what is a loadmaster? In supplemental operations, at least with National Air Cargo, the loadmaster is an airline employee who travels with the chartered aircraft. He supervises the loading of the aircraft, decides where the freight is located within the aircraft, and prepares the weight and balance forms for the pilots, who will determine the trim and approve calculations. Loadmasters are not, nor ever will be, FAA certificated. Why? Well, we'll cover that in a few minutes. What are cargo restraints? There are different types of restraints for different purposes. All cargo is restrained through the aircraft's cargo floor. There are a number of seat tracks that cargo locks and side rails are anchored into, and the floor transmits all dynamic cargo loads through the seat tracks in the cargo floor down into the aircraft floor structure. These loads are absorbed by the floor structure and out through the entire aircraft structure itself. Each cargo floor has a limited amount of strength to absorb these loads, determined by the manufacturer and accepted by the FAA engineering during certification. These limits are non-negotiable. They must be adhered to. Cargo floor restraints, such as retractable locks and side rails, are primary restraints. They physically latch or guide the unit load device. A unit load device is either a pallet or a container. Secondary restraints are, for example, nets. They are attached to the unit load device and restrain the freight to the unit load device. Special cargo straps are not primary restraints. Technically, they are not secondary restraints. Special cargo straps are not load-bearing restraints. They are extra strapping designed to compensate for unusual flight maneuvers that could act on the freight. They provide support to the primary restraints for unusual loads such as banking, pitching, and aborted takeoffs. They cover or attach to the freight and are locked directly into the floor, not the unit load device. They are installed only after the freight is locked in place in the aircraft and removed prior to the offload. And here is the fact that was so blindingly obvious, it was almost physically impossible to miss. Why? We have to ask ourselves, how can we prove it wasn't a cargo strap issue? If there was only a way. Well, and there is. The accident aircraft was a second leg. So the accident flight was the second leg of a two-part flight. The plane left Camp Bastion several hours earlier. Why then did N949 Charlie Alpha land in Bagram? To take on fuel for its last arrival later on in another airport. That was the only difference between the first Camp Bastion leg and the accident flight. The accident aircraft, N949CA, was the same aircraft on both legs. There wasn't an aircraft swap anywhere. The freight was never repositioned. It never was unsecured and moved to different positions. It remained locked in place through both legs. The flight crew and passengers didn't get off or new people didn't get on. The takeoff roll from Camp Bastion was identical to the accident takeoff roll out of Bagram. The climb profile from Camp Bastion was identical to the accident climb profile. So if every single thing was identical, if the configuration of the aircraft's loads and personnel never changed, how did the aircraft suddenly become unsafe? How did the conditions change so drastically if the Camp Bastion flight had no unusual loads like erratic rolls, pitches, or aborted takeoffs? What was the only difference between the two identical flights? The only difference was that N949CA landed in Bagram. That's it. Everything else was identical. If anything happened to the aircraft, that was when it would have happened. That's when it could have happened. And that's when it did. Second part of the probable cause talks about the damaged hydraulic systems, number 1 and 2 and horizontal stabilizer. But this is information without context. It sounded important, but without background, it didn't mean anything. Also, it downplayed the damage. It would be like saying the iceberg knocked out some of the Titanic's rivets. Now, as previously mentioned, the probable cause stated National Airlines' inadequate procedures for restraining special cargo loads, which resulted in the loadmaster's improper restraint of the cargo. This concept of special cargo was totally lost on NTSB investigators. It sounded cool, although they didn't really understand what it meant. They didn't understand the special cargo restraints had absolutely nothing to do with the accident. In section 1.10.2.1 of AAR 1501, the accident report, the loadmaster acknowledged the weights of the 5 military vehicles. 2 days before the accident flight, the military representative gave the 5 vehicle weights to the loadmaster. The military rep asked if the loadmaster knew any additional precautions we, the military, needed to take before confirming the load. The loadmaster knew that the accident aircraft's floor structural weight limitations said this shouldn't be a problem. The loadmaster set up the accident by allowing freight with known extreme weights to be loaded, weights that greatly exceeded the accident aircraft's floor structural weight limitations. But that wasn't the only safety problem. When any aircraft lands, there are forces acting on the airframe. The wings, engine mounts, the entire length of the fuselage all react to the landing. Flexing, shear loads, torsion loads are the forces that are designed into the aircraft. Upon landing in Bagram, the main gear absorbed all the weight of the aircraft. Aside from the landing gears absorbing the landing forces on N949CA, the accident aircraft, there were other enormous forces acting on the cargo floor. The B-747 could carry the weight that was loaded. That wasn't the problem. The danger was the 5 military vehicles' weights were in a small area of the flooring, not spread out through the 747. The excessive weights were focused on a small, particular area in the cargo bay. That's where the danger was. The B-747 can be very forgiving with overweight freight, but this payload was almost 1.5 times the allowed weight, and it was locked in place over a section of the floor that could not physically support the vehicle's combined weight by manufacturer's design. So when landing, 2 forces acted on N949CA's cargo floor. One was the excess weight, which stressed the floor and structure. The second force, which was the devastating force, was the descent forces that were expected to be arrested by the cargo floor. Now, Newton's second law of motion states force equals mass times acceleration. F equals ma. The mass and acceleration are proportional. If force remains the same, then if acceleration will increase while the mass decreases and vice versa. However, if the mass is constant and I increase acceleration, the force increases. This ball weighs 2 ounces. If I drop it on the cement, it will bounce back, but not as high because the ball has to overcome gravity and air resistance on the way up. Now, if I throw the ball harder, the ball will bounce higher because the force has changed. I increased the acceleration. The mass, 2 ounces, of the ball will remain the same. The force increased because the acceleration increased. The ball is structurally designed, however, to withstand the extra force of me throwing the ball down. Now, if I shoot this ball out of a cannon at the ground, the ball's structure will fail because the force is too great for the design of the ball. The mass remained the same, 2 ounces, but the acceleration increased, making the force increase beyond the ball's designed integrity. In National Air Cargo 102, the force was never determined by the NTSB Structures Group chairman. The mass of the 5 military vehicles was 176,000 pounds. The floor where the vehicles were positioned was structurally designed to sustain 120,000 pounds of weight. The combined weight of the military vehicles in this area was 176,000 pounds, which was 56,000 pounds or 28 tons more than the floor was designed to hold. Incidentally, remember the MATV in this picture weighed of 28,000 pounds each, and there were only 2 of them, and that the Cougar weighed 40,000 pounds each, and there were 3 of them. The vehicle weights exceeded the floor's design limits at rest. However, the plane had to land. So what force was on the floor at landing? Well, the acceleration equaled the descent rate of the 747 as the aircraft flared for landing, which was about 180 feet per minute. This was constant. It didn't change. The mass equaled 176,000 pounds of military vehicles in an area designed for 120,000 pounds. That's 28 tons of too much weight. The mass was 47% more mass than the floor could safely carry, that the floor could withstand. Force rose on the cargo floor because while the acceleration remained the same, the mass exceeded the structural limits by 47%. It was equivalent to shooting this ball out of a cannon. Now, when the aircraft landed in Bagram at the end of its first leg from Camp Bastion, the downward forces, the kinetic energy, went way beyond the design limits. The descent rate plus gravity added to the 176,000 pounds of pressure on an already overstressed floor. So what happened wasn't about special cargo straps. It never was. It was about the aircraft being loaded with freight too heavy for the cargo floor to sustain. What does that mean? Well, since the floor is the load-bearing structure for cargo locks, special cargo straps, and guide rails, after the plane landed in Bagram, the floor had buckled and failed. The freight, including the vehicles, had become unrestrained. The vehicles were free to move around. There was nothing to stop the 5 vehicles from moving aft and taking out the aft bulkhead because nothing was holding them in place. And when the aircraft rotated, the vehicles shot into the aft bulkhead in response to gravity, not the takeoff roll acceleration. There were no number of straps or cargo locks that would have stopped them. From the CVR transcript, the flight crew never even suspected the vehicles moved before the aircraft was 9 seconds in the air. If the NTSB investigators knew the straps weren't the problem, then shame on them for falsely reporting otherwise. However, if the NTSB investigators didn't know the straps weren't the problem, then shame on the NTSB board members and upper management for sending an unqualified group of investigators. And from the report's findings, it's obvious the NTSB did know the straps were not the problem, but they used the strap theory anyway. The report said so in finding number 1. According to finding number 1, Had the national airline's chief loadmaster consulted the required manufacturer's weight and balance manuals, he could have determined that the intended load of 5 vehicles could not be properly secured in the airplane in accordance with the tall cargo safety requirements. Reports stated this. Therefore, the NTSB knew the cargo loaded on board exceeded safety standards, but the NTSB went with the strap theory instead. Incidentally, the loadmaster would never have been required to consult the manufacturer's structural data. The loadmaster would have had information concerning each position's load limits in the National Air Cargo Operations Manuals. Some airlines placard the cargo position load limits near the aircraft cargo position and on the weight and balance forms to guarantee excessive weights are not loaded. To be honest, I'm not even sure a manufacturer's weight and balance manual is a real thing. Each air operator generates their own weight and balance manuals from their specific seating and cargo configurations the aircraft is built with or modified to with a supplemental type certificate. The NTSB should have researched this before putting this in an accident report. The NTSB clearly understood the safety issue was not that the cargo couldn't be properly secured. It was because the vehicles should never have been loaded to begin with, ever. Why then did the NTSB go with the strap story? All the structures group chairman's pictures of paint smears and broken locks were wasted. All he should have done was listen to the Boeing rep on page 66 of the structures report. It said, Boeing concluded that at most 1, not 2 or 3, not 4 or 5, just 1 M-ATV could be transported safely per the Boeing weight and balance manual provided enough airplane tie-down points existed. Remember I said a few slides ago, I said the MAT weighed 28,000 pounds each. Boeing said only 1 could be loaded on the 747, not 2. And Boeing certainly spoke against the 3 Cougars that weighed 40,000 pounds each from ever having been loaded on board at all. Think about that. Look, I get it. I've been there. Being an NTSB investigator means the industry is depending on you to fix a problem. And worse, NTSB management and board members are pressuring investigators to look for things they simply don't understand. However, admitting you don't know what you're doing in the beginning is way better than everybody finding out how wrong you were later on. And that's what I found in most NTSB investigators, NTSB managers who are former investigators, and especially NTSB board members who are not investigators at all. They will never admit they don't know. In addition, I've said it before, engineers should not be investigating aircraft accidents. These are not skills engineers are born with or learn. Investigating abilities on this level must be cultivated in the most serious of learning environments, such as heavy maintenance work. The NTSB is not a serious learning environment. For one, engineers never work on the aircraft. They design them. They don't fix them. Which leads to point 2, Aloha Air Flight 243. Before the Aloha Air 243 accident, which was a Boeing 737-200 that lost a good portion of the fuselage's crown, Boeing engineers expected the Boeing 737-200 series to last a few more decades. This mindset was shared at the time by Douglas and Lockheed. Now, although NTSB investigators who participated in the Aloha 243 investigation found inspection problems, they missed the big picture. Aloha's 737s flew in the most hostile conditions an airliner can. Salt air corrosion, high flight cycles, and numerous quick turns. All these conditions were dismissed by Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed engineers. Why? Because the engineers never saw the everyday effects. They were limited to working the design. The National Air Cargo Structures Group chairman may have graduated at the top of his class. He could have graduated from any school, from MIT to the University of Delaware. It didn't matter. He did not understand the basics of landing forces, of weight restrictions, of abuse by everyday conditions of the operation, and worse, as an NTSB investigator, he couldn't admit he didn't know. Now, this leads us to ask, how did cargo so grossly overweight ever get loaded inside the aircraft to begin with? It is now obvious the flight crew, at least the captain at the controls, and the loadmaster knew the aircraft was at risk, that they had intentionally ignored the aircraft's structural limits. But weren't there safeguards to prevent such irresponsible behavior? As a matter of fact, there were. They were part of the National Air Cargo's FAA-accepted computerized weight and balance program with proven procedures. By all rights, the computerized weight and balance program should have been followed, but it wasn't. National Air Cargo's accepted computerized weight and balance program was established and proven effective, and the computerized system would have stopped the loadmaster, would have prevented the vehicles from being placed on the aircraft in any position by rejecting the weight and balance calculations, and would have prevented the loadmaster from closing out the flight. Now, the 5 military vehicles were loaded before the first leg was out of Camp Bastion to Bagram, as we mentioned before. They were on board when the airplane landed in Bagram. The computerized weight and balance form, however, did not show the true weights of the 5 vehicles. The second leg was the accident flight. The 5 military vehicles were never moved or repositioned in Bagram, as mentioned before. The only thing that changed was there was fuel added for the second leg. Again, the computerized weight and balance form out of Bagram, which was the accident flight, also did not provide the actual weights in the cargo positions. There's only one reason for all the events that led to the National Air Cargo 102 accident, and that is shown in the manual weight and balance. The weight numbers were entered manually and not specific to cargo positions. As I stated, the 747 could carry the total weight as long as it was distributed evenly throughout the cargo area, not localized in a small area. As for National's computerized weight and balance system, the loadmaster bypassed the computerized system because he knew the computer would reject the loaded vehicles and prevent them from closing the flight. The NTSB went so far as to suggest the loadmaster be certificated, as if this would somehow magically fix the problem with the loadmaster. One may ask, isn't the loadmaster a safety-sensitive position? Well, it is. But the pilot is the check and balance, not the loadmaster. The job of the loadmaster is to report to the pilot. Obviously, the NTSB didn't understand this relationship because they recommended certification. Second recommendation, A-15-14, demonstrated the NTSB fundamentally didn't understand this certification process or what it was for. They called for a certification for personnel responsible for loading and restraint. In other words, the NTSB was speaking about certifying loadmasters. However, Title 14 CFR Parts 61 and 65 are the certification basis for pilots and technicians, such as aircraft mechanics and repairmen, and there isn't a certification process for loadmasters. The reason is non-certificated personnel, such as loadmasters, are responsible for generating a load sheet and weight and balance calculations. They oversee the loading of freight but are not authorized as the final signature. The FAA certificated pilot signs for the aircraft's load, not the loadmaster. Similarly, technicians also are FAA certificated and can sign for the airworthiness of an aircraft. Certification of airmen isn't about the job, it's about the certification given authority for the certificate holder to allow release of an aircraft for service. Loadmasters, since they go through the pilot, can never do this. Now, why did the NTSB accuse the FAA of providing inadequate oversight? National Air Cargo was operating as a supplemental flight. The FAA is not allowed to conduct surveillance in foreign countries without that country's permission. This means the FAA cannot conduct oversight within another country's borders without express permission of that government. Now, since National Air Cargo flew regular contracts for the military, the FAA would have to apply for a visa for every flight and for every single country the plane lands in, which is kind of impossible and unlikely to happen. So what availability was there for the FAA to conduct oversight and surveillance outside the US? It was very limited ability by the rules. The problem was that while the supplemental operation was out of the FAA's area of oversight, in this case, National's loadmaster violated weight and balance procedures. The pilot ignored his responsibility to the aircraft's safety by not questioning the weights. All this was conducted outside the FAA's jurisdiction and ability to observe. This demonstrated the NTSB doesn't understand the basic concept of oversight and surveillance, that they aren't serious about recommendations and probable causes they produce. This is an important point. The FAA did everything they were supposed to do, what the FAA is allowed to do by international law. Yet the NTSB felt necessary to criticize the FAA, entered into an accident report what they clearly didn't comprehend what is and what isn't the FAA's ability outside the United States. It's almost as if operators like National Air Cargo look for the NTSB to be duped into making these types of baseless accusations because they distract from the operator's mistakes themselves. Even if the FAA inspector was standing on the flight deck within 2 feet of the captain, that FAA inspector has no cause to doubt or question the captain's actions. It's the operator's responsibility to be safe. The FAA does not babysit. So does the NTSB suggest that the FAA should look over the shoulder of every single pilot or of every single mechanic who has ever been certificated and trained to do their jobs? If not, then the NTSB must stop wasting everyone's time and space in the report, assigning blame where it doesn't belong. The NTSB is supposed to create solutions, not major in rhetoric. Otherwise, the NTSB is nothing more than an echo chamber, a room where their accusations get kind of stale. And there's something else that's important here. This so-called probable cause by itself demonstrated the NTSB's lack of regulatory understanding. In AAR-1501 on page 1, the NTSB pointed out that National Air Cargo Flight 102 was operated as a supplemental flight. So what is a supplemental flight? Looking at the definition under Title 14 CFR Section 110.2, definitions, a supplemental flight means any common carriage operation for compensation or hire. I'll read that again. Any common carriage operation for compensation or hire conducted with any aircraft described in paragraph 1 of this definition, that is a type of operation described in paragraph 2 of this section. Now, paragraph 1 states that airplanes qualify for a supplemental flight as long as they meet the point of paragraph 2, have a payload capacity of more than 7,500 pounds. Now, National Air Cargo 747 N949CA is an airplane. It has a payload capability way over 7,500 pounds. But then there has to be a meeting of paragraph 2. And types of operations under paragraph 2, subparagraph 1 says operations for which the departure time, departure location, and arrival location are specifically negotiated with the customer or the customer's representative. And paragraph 2 states all cargo operations. So N949CA was negotiated, that Flight 102 was negotiated with the military. The negotiations spelled out the departure time, departure location, which happened to be Bagram, and arrival location, which was supposed to be Al Maktoum Airport in Dubai. It appears the NTSB investigators either didn't understand the term supplemental operation or thought all cargo flight airlines flew only scheduled service. It's important to point out this problem with NTSB regulation interpretations. National Air Cargo Flight 102 was a supplemental flight where the aircraft, flight crew, and support staff were operated for compensation, meaning National Air Cargo contracted Flight 102 for money in return for services rendered. Who contracted with the National Air Cargo? Well, the United States military. There were other contracts for other supplemental operators that had been with other airlines, such as what was the case with the 1997 accident involving Fine Air 101, who was contracted with the freight operator Aeromar. Other supplemental carriers include FedEx, UPS, Atlas, Polar, Skylease, Kalitta, Amerijet, ABX, and etc. They fly freight for the military and other paying customers who ship anything from flowers to horses to family cars. The fact the NTSB didn't take this accident seriously demonstrated that any facts that could have improved safety at the cargo airlines were lost because the NTSB lacked understanding of what supplemental operations were and a basic disconnection with how the aviation industry works. Where are supplemental flights operated? Literally, from anywhere in the world to anywhere in the world, without stopping in the U.S. for weeks. The FAA has no international legal right to fly on or conduct oversight and surveillance on these aircraft while they are outside the United States. The NTSB board members adopted this report. One of them was even a former pilot who should have known what a supplemental operation was, but somehow didn't think about that. Now, the FAA has agreements with countries in the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, to employ the International Aviation Safety Assessment Program and the Universal Safety Oversight Audit Program, too, to close the gap between countries and make travel safe. But that's not done every day. They are not regularly scheduled events. The fact the NTSB stated the FAA had inadequate oversight of National Air Cargo's handling of special cargo loads was irresponsible, fundamentally false, and to put it nicely, extremely naive. An organization of the NTSB's renown should be more careful of how it demonstrates what it doesn't know. Before we move on, there was another problem with this accident investigation, and that was that the military was not permitted as a party to the investigation. Military specialists who understand the contracts with operators like National Air Cargo were refused a place in the investigation. That was a really bad idea. Review again what the loadmaster said about the vehicles loaded on National Air Cargo 102. The military representative gave exact weights to the loadmaster, who should have shut down the flight because he would have known, not should have or could have, but did know the weight limitations of each cargo floor position. Instead, he responded that it shouldn't be a problem. That this statement was an AR 1501 demonstrated the NTSB knew the weights were a problem, but ignored these facts for blaming the accident on cargo straps. When I worked with the FAA's Eastern Regional Office's Transport Division, when N949CA, the National Air Cargo 102 aircraft crashed, I was the DoD liaison, the Department of Defense liaison. I worked with the military when they conducted annual audits of all supplemental operators in the Eastern region. The military was extremely tenacious about safety. What was extremely odd was the NTSB refused a seat to the military representatives for the investigation. Again, NTSB upper management and the board members saw these problems in the report as part of their adoption of the report. They knew the investigators, including the investigator in charge, were not qualified to make AAR 1501's findings, probable causes, and recommendations. But they allowed these report mistakes to continue anyway. How do we know this? The board members adopted the report. Why did we start with this accident specifically? Using this accident it is a time to review Title 49, Section 831.4, particularly Paragraph A, which lays out the NTSB's investigatory responsibilities. The key points in orange show that the NTSB must determine the facts, conditions, and circumstances relating to an accident. The NTSB must use the results of these facts to determine probable cause and issue safety recommendations to prevent and mitigate future accidents. In National Air Cargo 102, the NTSB failed to examine the facts, created findings out of speculation, and wrote recommendations that ignored the intent of federal regulations. The key point in red, the NTSB investigators are required to report the facts. They failed to apply facts to the loads, exceeding the structural strength of the floor, the failures to prevent the loading of the vehicles when the pilots and loadmaster should have rejected them, then tried to blame the accident on special cargo straps whose function was not to do what the NTSB said they were supposed to do. Meanwhile, the key point in blue, NTSB upper management, including the 5 board members, did not monitor the situation and assess available facts. Instead, the board members and upper management sent investigators who missed important information, such as the structures investigator, who failed to take the Boeing representative's lead and point out the vehicle's weights exceeded the floor limits and allowed the non-factual strap theory to be added to the probable cause. Then there was the operations investigator, who failed to note the damage didn't occur until after the aircraft rotated, not during the takeoff roll. If the straps and restraints would have failed like investigators alleged, the aircraft would have become tail heavy and had a tail stripe sometime during the 46-second takeoff roll. That the final 9 seconds before the recorders were lost didn't raise concern by anyone on the flight deck. No one noticed anything wrong with the controlling of the takeoff roll. The maintenance investigator failed to understand the Boeing representative found the vehicle's weights exceeded the structural limits that the loadmaster and pilot should have known. This knowledge should have led to floor integrity checks along the side walls of the floor structure of N949CA in Bagram by the 2 mechanics who were on board. And then there was the investigator in charge, who did not have the experience to work an accident that's complicated in nature. This IIC lacked any experience of working a major accident with party members like Boeing, National Air Cargo's different airline representatives, and the military. NTSB upper management and board members chose this IIC, and they made dangerous, irresponsible, and unprofessional decisions in this investigation. How do we know the IIC was not qualified? So why would the IIC generate a PowerPoint presentation to justify his being on the investigation? This 50-page sales pitch was a ridiculous response to questions about the IIC's qualifications after the investigation took place in Bagram. He was unqualified. End of story. Again, the board members intentionally launched an unqualified IIC on this important investigation. And finally, pictures of the accident site must be restricted to being used for analysis purposes only. That the IIC posed for pictures found on the internet with the National Air Cargo accident site as a background demonstrated that this photo op was disrespectful of the victim's family's grief, made light of the accident's serious nature, and derided the professional environment of an NTSB investigation. I mean, who does this? It's unprofessional. But this IIC event deserves closer scrutiny. When I was trained in the FAA and in industry, on-the-job training was delivered in 3 levels. Level 1 was the student, the trainee, researched the task to be done or took it in classroom training. This meant we became familiar with the task, say conducting an operator oversight. Level 2, the trainee watches the mentor who demonstrates how to do the task, like how to conduct that said oversight and what to look for. Level 3, the trainee, under the mentor's supervision, performs the task. Only then is an FAA inspector qualified or an aircraft mechanic qualified to perform the task that was trained on. To be clear, this IIC, whose PowerPoint presentation defended his opinion that working general aviation accidents were somehow equal to working a major accident, was bizarre. But here's what happened in Bagram. This IIC, untrained IIC, wasn't given a level 1 training experience, a chance to become familiar with the IIC position for major accidents. Then he was sent halfway around the world to whatever time zone out of sequence with Washington in Afghanistan, unsupervised, without any mentor or help, no level 2, no level 3 training. And to top it off, this was a critically important investigation where the other NTSB investigators had made serious mistakes. The IIC had to deal with the 2 military bases, Afghanistan officials, foreign work crews, manufacturers, etc., all of which he had 0 experience with. And what does this say about the quality of NTSB major accident IICs or investigators, for that matter? This event makes NTSB IICs look pretty common, that anyone can do their job. All you have to do is create a PowerPoint presentation with lots of pictures. NTSB upper management and the board members own these failures for putting unqualified and inexperienced investigators on this accident, an accident that would have benefited supplemental airlines and the military when contracting the moving of military equipment. That another accident of this type has not happened is not because of NTSB's diligence, but because the military, working with the FAA, made sure the mistakes were never repeated. I know that firsthand. One more thing. Let me explain what happened at the FAA, specifically at their FAA Academy training department. When the AAR 1501 accident report came out, FAA trainers with no cargo experience decided to rewrite the Academy's Air Cargo Course number 21000056 to include and focus hours of talking about special cargo. The same special cargo that had nothing to do with the National Air Cargo 102 accident. Now, when the Academy Course 21000056 course rewrite was completed, they invited representatives from the military, air carriers, and the principal inspectors for the cargo carriers to review the course. It received the lowest marks of any FAA course to date. Yet somehow the course made it through approval and was taught to hundreds of FAA new hires who were then sent out to the field with bogus information. Why would FAA trainers get training so wrong? I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. So what are the lessons of National Air Cargo Flight 102? Where to begin? Anyone can cause the crash of an accident, even those who are responsible for its safety. The flight crew and loadmaster bear the total responsibility for what happened that day, who, by their training, knew the vehicles were beyond the structural limits of the aircraft, who, by their actions, purposely removed the only safeguard, the computerized weight and balance system, to put the mission above safety, and who, upon checking the straps and noticing the looseness in Bagram, never asked the mechanics to check the structure. Incidentally, The two mechanics who were never asked to check the floor structure died in the accident. Next, the NTSB knew they had sent inexperienced people to investigate the accident. The four NTSB investigators didn't understand supplemental operations and the rules they operate under. The FAA wasn't being irresponsible, but was limited by international law. To suggest otherwise was a deflection from the NTSB's incompetence and lack of understanding, and it was particularly wrong to put it in an accident report. And then there was the manual weight and balance forms and cargo floor positions, as Boeing tried to point out, were important clues that were ignored. Then there was the NTSB investigator in charge, who knew he was out of his depth, but chose his career over correct safety investigating, as per his PowerPoint presentation. And then there was the NTSB board members and upper management who knew they were sending a go team with unqualified investigators and an unqualified IIC, but sent them anyway. What does that say about their decision-making process? Remember, one of the board members was a former pilot of an airline that did supplemental operations, and he didn't call it out in the report. But there was also the go team was unqualified, and anything they reported was wrong. But NTSB board members and upper management doubled down and put it in the report anyway, and it adopted the report as they did. Now, unfortunately, this will not be the last NTSB accident investigation we report on with these types of mistakes. I truly wish I could say otherwise. Until next time, I'm Stephen Carbone, reminding you to tab. Think safe, act safe, be safe. Take care.